I started panicking about Trump way earlier than most people because I saw so many parallels between him and all these scary dictators I read about. So most of you heard of the Cultural Revolution, right? At least you watched the Three-Body Problem, right? But very few Americans seem to know why it happened. Well, most Chinese don't know it either. So I implore you to read up on some materials or at least ask the Chat GPT. The motivation for that 10-year-long unspeakable event was actually pretty simple. So the Cultural Revolution happened because China's top leader, Chairman Mao, tried to replace the technocrats in the entire government with loyalists who wouldn't question him. That's almost the only reason. If you don't believe me, go look it up. Why am I talking about this? Well, I just read this report saying that DOGE has fired more than 216,000 federal employees so far, the biggest job cut event anywhere in recent history. The only parallel I can think of was the Cultural Revolution. So why was Mao so against technocrats? Well, because they were a threat to his personal authority. Firstly, there was an external event. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's successor Khrushchev made a speech trashing his late boss ruthlessly. That speech basically destroyed Stalin's legacy like overnight. And that made Mao quite anxious about what his own people thought of him. And then a few years later, Mao's economic policy led to a huge famine. It was so terrible that the Communist Party had to sideline him from economic affairs. Well, he was still the number one, still the face of the party. And the cult of personality was still designed around him. But he was no longer the policy guy. And this Vice Chairman Liu took over most of the policy making duties because he had some administrative skills that Mao didn't have. That really made Mao believe that Liu was going to become the Chinese Khrushchev. So insecurity was probably the main factor, but maybe he was also just bored. I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of boredom. When a dictator gets bored, millions have to play with him. That's a big problem. So anyway, to restore his authority, he had to get rid of not only Mr. Liu, but also the entire technocrat class in the government, who might question him. So how can one person purge so many people without causing a rebellion? Well, his leverage was the cult of personality. So he encouraged these young people, especially high schoolers and middle schoolers, to smash the government agencies in the name of a continued revolution. Like, dude, what do you mean? You're already the chairman. What revolution are you talking about? Well, he asked people to rebel against the hidden capitalist rulers in the government, which was basically the communist equivalent of a deep state. You see what I mean? Essentially, those were the people who had training in a certain task based on some technical standards. And Mao couldn't have that. If you believe in any objective standards such as math, you believe less in me. That's not okay. So he used his power as the face of communism to mobilize ordinary people against his own government. Now imagine those teenagers who grew up in a suffocating asexual culture and all their libido had nowhere to go. And now that they had the green light to go smash things, they're like perfect. I'll skip the rest of the stories because it's too long, but basically all the technocrats were kicked out of the government, if not jailed or killed. So not only that, all the universities were closed. China stopped providing college education for 10 years. Why? Because independent thinkers come from colleges. Mao was just nipping them in the bud. That should ring a bell for Americans, right? So fast forward to 2025, Trump is facing the same problem. Of course, the American system is very different. There are at least two parties and many different ideologies. But in any country, there's a technocrat class in the government. A lot of federal employees are conservatives, sure, but they also have a separate identity, which came from their years of professional training. They tend to uphold a certain procedural norm regardless of who they voted for, and that norm is a big threat to Trump. Remember what happened to his first administration. Half of his own cabinet members turned against him. They were all hardcore Republicans, no doubt, but they couldn't stand him personally. Even those who stayed on his side mostly didn't get hired back in the second administration. I wouldn't call any of them like good people. Okay, I wouldn't hire them if I were the boss. But most of them at least were trained experts in certain areas, and they had some standards on what's technically right and what's not. And those technical standards were the reason the first Trump term didn't end up in a recession like what we're going to have now. It was still bad, but they pulled through. But this time around, Trump's objective is different. He's no longer aiming at winning elections because there's a term limit anyway. So this time he needs nothing less than a coup. That's something the technocrats can't help him with, no matter how conservative they are. So this time around, he needs loyalists and loyalists only. In other words, he needs a cultural revolution. So someone leaked that Elon Musk and Marco Rubio recently had a small fight in a cabinet meeting. So Musk, who's not a cabinet member, scolded Rubio, the state secretary, for not firing enough people. Too bad there's no video. I really want to see how the fucking state secretary gets scolded by a tech support. But then here's how Rubio defended himself. He was like, more than 1,000 people took the buyouts. That's the same as firing. So you see what I mean? Firing people became the new political correctness in this administration. Okay, the more you fire, the more you serve the great leader. Simple. Trump doesn't have teenage red guards, not yet anyway, but he has Elon and his teenage Excel sheet readers. This is no doubt a digital cultural revolution. And the brain drain as a result is why they messed up so bad with the tariff calculations and with the signal scandal. You know, they could just find other countries' tariff schedules and then find the US export data on each category and then just do a weighted average. It should have been a piece of cake. I can do it if they pay me enough. But no, they had to use ChatGPT. There will be more mess ups like this. Okay, way more than the first term. Actually, 2 kids died of measles already, a completely preventable disease, because for some reason, a brainworm guy is so much better than an actual scientist. Speaking of cultural revolution, I think people should stop trying to understand Trump with a left-right mindset. If he had an option of turning America into the communist North Korea, he wouldn't hesitate to take it. He loves being Kim Jong-un. Every building would become a Trump Tower. Wouldn't that be nice? And it's not about the Christian Western culture either. If Trump had an option of ruling America like a Chinese emperor, like taking 1,000 foot-binding concubines for himself, he would do it in a heartbeat. This guy plays with ideologies, but his actions are not ideological motivated. Like every tyrant before him, he's motivated by taking control over other human beings.